Hi. I'd like to welcome all of you to today's Tocqueville Project lecture. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to take a moment to thank some people and groups that have made this talk and a lot of the things we do here at UNO possible. That includes the UNO Department of Philosophy, the UNO Student Government Association, the Charles Koch Foundation, the John Templeton Foundation, the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University, and a number of local donors and businesses that help us out. And now the reason you're here, Mike Munger.
Yes! Yes!
Clap! They can cooperate. Michael Munger.
That's so sad.
You've already met him through that. He's a lot of fun. You're not going to let me get through this. Mike Munger is an economist and former chair of the political science department at Duke University, where he continues to teach political science, public policy, and economics. Munger earned a BA in economics at Davidson College, MA in economics at Washington University, and a PhD in economics also at Washington University. He is the author of numerous scholarly articles, op-eds, and books, including Analyzing Policy, Choices, Conflicts, and Practices, which is now a standard work in the field of policy analysis. In 2008, he was also the Libertarian candidate for governor of North Carolina.
What the hell is wrong with you?
I pulled this from your own bio. You were relatively successful. Today he is here to talk about market failure and sensible regulation. So please join me in welcoming Mike Munger.
It was in running for governor that I learned that if I don't lead the applause, I usually won't get them. Which is pretty sad. This is a topic I've worked on and off for a bit, and the metaphor of the unicorn, you'll see why it's so important. But let me use a different animal metaphor to begin with. It seems to me that in a polarized political environment, we often find that both sides run some version of the pretty pig contest. Now, there are different versions of this. I'm from Florida, and now I live in North Carolina, and so I think of it as the pretty pig contest. I think the original version of it was a Roman emperor who was asked to judge a contest between two minstrels whose job it was to sing. The first minstrel came out and sang and was so apocalyptically bad, the emperor said, "Oh, give it to the second person." Unheard. But I think the pretty pig version is better. So at the state fair, they have a pretty pig contest. There's not many. The first pig is brought out. Ah! It's hard to say even what's going on there. I mean, when you look, there's the tusks going out to the side, there's the roof of his mouth. So you look and you say, okay, give the prize to the second pig. But you haven't seen the second pig. That's an ugly pig. Well, so often when people talk about there are severe problems with markets and therefore we would like the state to regulate, there really are problems with markets. But that doesn't mean that the state will do better. Likewise, many people who look at what they think are problems with the state, they single out, this is something the state has done badly, the EPA released all of that pollution into the river, and say, well, so let's just let markets do it, is equally one-sided. So I'm hoping that we can try to dispel both our own and that of the other side, whichever our own and the other side's is, sense of not doing a fair comparison. So here's a logic of policy analysis that I see increasingly frequently. Y is a problem. We should do something. Forgive me, X is a problem. We should do something. Y is something. Therefore, we should do Y. Step 3 is weak. The therefore doesn't really follow. If Y does not solve X, it means we didn't do enough Y and we need to do more. If you oppose doing more Y, you hate people who suffer from X. So for example, it's easy to think of this. I am an economist by training. I teach graduate macroeconomics, and so I tend to think in these terms. But suppose it's 1824 and your daughter has a fever. Now, you really care about your daughter, and so you call the doctor. The doctor comes, and if the doctor shows up and says, you know, we really don't know much about fevers, there's not much we can do, you fire him, because you want somebody to do something. So a different doctor comes, and he has a small, very sharp piece of metal called a lancet, and he opens a vein in her wrist and takes half a pint of blood. The fever does not abate. He takes another half pint of blood. Her fever gets worse. He takes another half pint of blood, and she dies. And the doctor said, we should have bled her more. So if you oppose that, it means you don't love your daughter. But this is actually a perfect summary of the sort of Keynesian economics that Paul Krugman has repeatedly advocated. There's unemployment. That's a problem. We should do something. Large-scale stimulus projects are something. We should spend billions on stimulus. If there's still unemployment, we didn't spend enough on stimulus. And if you disagree, you just hate poor people. And I could equally well do this from the right. There's a problem in Iraq. If you think we should do nothing, you just hate America. We need more troops. If we eventually send more troops and it doesn't work, what's the problem? We didn't send enough troops. Not our whole model of this was wrong. So I'm not trying to make a particularly partisan point here. I think both sides have resorted to this. I think this is the sort of thing that we should think about. Who recognizes this picture? It's really Korea. It's an almost perfect natural experiment. This is a group of people with thousands of years of shared culture. And we have a treatment effect and a control group. Now, I have colleagues at Duke that say the North is clearly better because it's using less energy. None of them want to move to North Korea, mind you. So in terms of, I suppose, damage to the environment, maybe North Korea is doing less because the mules they're trying to use to plow those frozen fields do less damage than the modern tractors that are being used in South Korea. But in terms of prosperity, in terms of human flourishing, we have a pretty good comparison there between two quite different systems. So this is a quote from Edmund Burke. Now, I admit it's the young Edmund Burke, but it's quite provocative. The young Edmund Burke was kind of a radical. In vain, you tell me, artificial government is good, I fall out only with the abuse. The thing itself is the abuse. Observe, my lord, I pray you, that grand error upon which all artificial legislative power is founded. It was observed that men had ungovernable passions which made it necessary to guard against the violence they might offer to each other. They appointed governors over them for this reason, but a worse and more perplexing difficulty arises, how to be defended against the governors. So it seems to me both sides, when they get a criticism, that is the sort of free market extremists and the pro-state extremists, when they're confronted with a contradiction, will defend by saying, well, this is only, we just have bad people. That is, you fall out only with the abuse. But extreme forms of both of those are probably flawed. So I wanted to tell the story of unicorns because I find that often this is a useful way of diagnosing the difficulties you're having talking to someone who disagrees with you. Consider this proposition. Unicorns are the ideal solution for urban mass transit because teams of unicorns could easily pull buses through cities. The advantage of unicorns is that they can carry enormous loads for a long time without getting tired. All they eat is rainbows, and their flatulence smells like fresh strawberries. So when one goes by, you go, oh, that was a unicorn, that's nice. You know, a bus goes by, but when the unicorn goes by, that's nice. Now, what is the problem with my proposal for solving the problem of urban mass transit? You're probably going to want to say, you're a nut. Unicorns don't exist. Ah, but they do. Close your eyes. Think of a unicorn. Mine is pink. It has a white horn, and it's surrounded by rainbows, so perhaps it's lunchtime. Unicorns exist, and I've just proved it. All of you can easily imagine one. The word that I use to say unicorn creates in your mind a very similar image. So the problem that I see is that many of our public policy debates are premised on unicorns. Now, can anybody identify that Soviet-seeming statue in Washington, D.C.? Well, let's deconstruct. It's a large, frankly pretty hot man, very muscular, well-built, but clearly overmatched by the enormous power of the horse that he's trying to restrain. He's trying to get a halter onto a harness onto this horse. And the horse is biting him. He really doesn't have much hope of controlling it. Now, on the other side, you look just from a little bit closer, you see the comparison in size and the muscles of the horse and the man. And this is on the other side of the same building. It's the U.S. Federal Trade Commission. So the metaphor is pretty clear. The horse is the big, stupid thing called markets, and the man is regulation. Now, the reason I know this was that this was the first place that I worked out of graduate school. I was a staff economist for the U.S. Federal Trade Commission. So I worked in antitrust policy and consumer protection. Is that the way that we should think about markets and regulators? Well, let's look at a story of unicorns in action. Now, this is something that I've written about. You may, if those of you that listen to Econ Talk have heard this, if you listen to Russ Roberts, but I'll try to go through it quickly. The Chilean bus system in Santiago de Chile, the capital, they had 3,000 private bus companies. City of 6 million, 3,000 private bus companies. One of the largest urban private mass transit systems in the world. They had a number of problems. One of them was pollution, because these buses and jitneys were not very well regulated. The amount of pollution, these were not unicorns. They didn't smell like strawberries. They really put out a lot of pollution. There was a problem that people who saw this system were worried about, and that was that in toto, these 3,000 bus companies made more than $60 million US in profits per year. Now, I don't really see that as a problem. I look at an urban mass transit system operating in the black without public subsidy and think that's actually pretty good. But it was seen as a problem. The third problem was certainly real, and it was probably the most important reason why Transantiago was changed. These bus drivers were competing for what looked like a common pool resource. So what that usually leads to in the ocean is overfishing. So if we can all fish in the same area, we'll overfish. Well, if there was a line of passengers at a bus stop, whoever got there first got all the passengers. And it meant that although driving in Santiago wasn't very dangerous, there was a lot of accidents because bus drivers were racing each other to get to the bus stop. And so it really was a problem. They were worried about greed. So these were different manifestations of greed. The pollution, because people didn't take care of their buses. The profits, because people were making profits off of the people's back. And the third was this competition for passengers. So the curb rights were common pool, and so it became more dangerous. So this is an actual picture. Okay, that's the chariot scene from Ben-Hur. But the chariot scene in Ben-Hur was pretty similar to the way that the buses were behaving on the streets of Santiago. So the government decided in February of 2007, and this is in the southern hemisphere, so February is their August. Everybody's on summer break. The city is basically empty. None of the students are in school. And so they bought a lot of these big Volvo bendy buses, which were actually much too wide for the small streets of Santiago, but it seemed efficient to the planners. It seemed like it would be a good idea to do this. I spent quite a bit of time in Santiago. I've seen these buses pull over to the right, pull over to the left so they can turn right, and then of course a car comes in and then they take off the whole front of the car when they turn right. Because these buses are 30 meters long. They're enormous buses. And the idea was that the new public bus system was going to be much better for the people, and it was not. The first few days, remember there's nobody in town and there's no students, but the first 2 days after Transantiago was implemented in February of 2007 were just disastrous. And there were a number of reasons why this was true. The two greatest were because of routes and incentives. Here's the incentives one. And I actually took videos of this, and then I would interview people from the government bus agency, and they would deny that this was happening, but then it turned out that it was happening a whole lot. Remember, one of the problems was that drivers were greedy in responding to incentives. Ugly pig! We just need the other pig because we know it's pretty. So they said to drivers, you will be paid based on how on time you are. Does anybody see a problem with that? So you're driving along, you're 2 or 3 minutes late. You see a bus stop full of passengers. What do? I've seen 3 or 4 half-full buses just blow by. And of course, the more people who show up, the longer it would take them to stop and pick them all up. So they didn't. The government denied this. Why? These people work for the state. They're not greedy. The fundamental public choice insight is that people are basically people. They respond to incentives. Wouldn't it be astonishing if some sort of moral transubstantiation takes place? If you tell me I'm going to get paid based on some kind of metric, that's the metric I'm going to use to judge my behavior and to set my goals. They weren't bad people. The other drivers weren't bad people. This was the way the system was set up. The mass transit system from hell. You may not have seen that way of approaching this before. So just start with the yellow. I hate Transantiago with every bone in my body, she says of the city's widely despised new transit system. Watching a bus heaving with passengers trundle towards her down a congestion. I used to take 1 bus to work, and now I have to take 3. It's made the lives of millions of people more difficult and more miserable. Ugly pig, we know the other pig's going to be better, and it was much worse. The average commute time went from 40 minutes to almost 2 hours. Rich people, as always, have an alternative. They could drive their Mercedes. They could pay somebody to do it. Poor people had no choice. They either lost their jobs or had to leave from home at 4 o'clock in the morning. And the people who did this meant well. I don't deny that for a moment. They absolutely thought that first pig was ugly and we could just do better. How do you know it's going to be better? Well, it's us. It's the government. It's got to be better. Well, it doesn't have to be. Here's really the problem. The one on the left is a representation of the old system. So the lines that I've drawn under the old system, those were existing bus routes. What do we know about them? They were profitable. It was a private system. They were profitable. That meant that so many people wanted to take that route that it was worth doing. The planners who looked at this system threw out all of that very useful information and looked instead at the map anew and said, well, we can increase ridership on the metro. which is the subway system, the red dotted line. So they put in a hub and spoke system. So what the woman said, before I could take one bus and now I have to take three, that was intentional. It's absolutely intentional. What could possibly go wrong? Notice in the other system, there's redundancy. Now engineers think redundancy is good, because that means if something breaks, you have other ways of doing it. Metro goes down, I can still go on the bus. One bus line goes down, I have another way to go. Planners like efficiency. Efficiency means getting rid of redundancy. So if any part of this system broke, the whole thing was so fragile now. So she used to take one, now she has to take three. So what was once a 40-minute trip now has to take 2 hours. The president, the then president, Michelle Bachelet, made an unusual admission just days after its disastrous rollout. It's not common for a president to stand before a nation and say things haven't gone well with a bus system. In fact, I think this may be the only time in history that a national president apologized for a municipal bus system. The mayor might, but Chile is a unified system. It's not a federal system. She lost the election because the buses sucked, which is really, but they sucked so hard. They were really bad buses. So let's think about the insight that was thrown away just because it was part of the ugly pig. And there's a rule, and some of you have probably thought of it, but it's a pretty deep insight. Suppose you're starting a new university. Starting a university, you've got the buildings. Where do you put the sidewalks? Wait 2 years, look for the muddy paths, and pave those. Because you don't know where people want to go. No one knows where they want to go, but the muddy paths show where many people want to go. Wait 2 years, muddy paths, pave those, and you're good. So what it means is that I can't look forward. I can't possibly have enough information to look forward and solve this problem. But I can if I use the information that's available in the habits of many people, because that's really what I'm trying to do. Now, in a way, that's a Hayekian insight. That's something that F.A. Hayek would have said, but there's a problem with that, too. So the joke that you may have heard is, how many libertarians does it take to change a light bulb? Well, none, because the market will do it. I think that's probably not right. Somebody has to do it. So at Hayek University, that's where the paths go. Where did you put the buildings? I imagine this as a kind of Monty Python skit. Oh, look, there's a group of sociologists over there in that copse of trees. They're holding a class. That's where the sociology building will be. You have to plan some things. It's just not true that you can rely on the spontaneous emergence of everything. Some things have to be planned. Wouldn't it be great if you could just say, all right, that's it, the state's always wrong? It's not. Wouldn't it be great if you could just say, the state's always right? Well, no, that's not. Here's the problem. This is an actual interview. It's pretty remarkable. This is an interview with a planner of Santiago, and this is his defense. I'm making air quotes. There was a perception that the main goal of the system was not to save time, but to reduce accidents, prevent drivers from competing, and reduce noise and pollution. All of those objectives were met from the beginning. We won. But the system was performing so badly, the users couldn't appreciate these benefits. In the face of the poor service, except for the poor service, it was good. So everything we were going for, we accomplished. These whining bastards, I don't know what's wrong with them. So there's two problems that we face in trying to decide which public policy to choose. There's a lot of work in behavioral economics that say consumers do a bad job choosing. Problem is that every flaw in consumers is worse in voters. Lack of information, the fact that we're attracted to free stuff. So my Duke colleague, Dan Ariely, and I often argue about this. Dan Ariely is the author of Predictably Irrational. And in it, he shows that consumers are not capable of making the choices that we require of them in a market economy. And of course, he's right. And his solution then is that the state, the other pig, should regulate things. Except that, wait, every flaw in consumers is worse in voters. Now what? If we tell voters that they're going to decide how to direct consumers, they're just looking in the mirror. And then I'm going to talk about the right kind of nothing. So when we think of the problem that consumers have, asymmetric information, deceptive attractiveness of free stuff, lack of good detailed knowledge about what's good for us, the unwillingness to choose what's good for us even if we know it. So in the absence of markets, the knowledge problem is actually even worse. We don't know very much. But in the case of the buses, we threw out the information that we did have and substituted an even worse system. So aggregating information through politics also doesn't work. The problem is that human beings don't know very much. You need some systems for aggregating information. So I have suggested, immodestly, that people use the Munger Test. And the Munger Test is this: when someone says the state should do something, stop them and say, you realize the state is a unicorn. What you're talking about is actual human beings. So instead of the state, take out the word the state and put in actual human politicians elected by a system dominated by large interest groups, and see if you still believe it. So I think that the state should have large groups of armed people in the military. Take that out and say, I think Dick Cheney should have large groups of highly trained military personnel, and he should be in charge of them, and he should pretty much be able to send them places without congressional permission. You're a lot less likely to agree because the state is such a nice thing. Strawberries, did I mention the strawberries? The state is so great, and it exists. I can see it. I close my eyes, I totally see it. Unicorns think, everyone thinks unicorns are pure and magical, but they're actually jerks. He's taken his backpack. They judge you for your taste in music. They hog your French fries, monopolize the ball pit. You've probably seen this. And then when you say they're being a jerk, they say, no, you're being the jerk. You're the one. When is a potato chip not a potato chip? Let me see if I can make this work.
Art and Betty.
Here we go.
It's a potato chip, not a potato chip. When it's an externality. An externality is when a transaction between two people, call them Art and Betty, has an effect on a third person, Carl, without Carl's permission. Suppose Art sells Betty some potato chips. Now Betty really likes potato chips. She opens the bag, she's looking forward to eating the chips. As she eats them, she makes yum, yum, yum sound. Just look at her, she loves it. But no matter how loud she is, there is no externality unless someone, like Carl, is there to hear her. Obviously, Art benefits from selling the product, and Betty benefits from buying the product, since this exchange was voluntary. But Carl's affected by a negative externality. He's harmed. He didn't get anything, but he has to listen to all that crunching, yum, yumming. Really annoys him. So it takes three to have an externality: a seller, a buyer, and at least one additional person who is not voluntarily a participant in the transaction. In a previous video, I claimed that prices can tell people the right thing to do. But if there are externalities, do prices tell us everything we need to know? The answer must be no, because with externalities, the price of something and its actual cost are different. The price is the amount Betty paid to Art. but the cost is the amount Betty paid to Art plus the cost to Carl of having Betty punch potato chips in his ear during class. The problem of externalities is that prices do not capture all of the costs of the transaction. Instead, some of the costs are borne by people who never gave their permission. It seems like the solution would be to try to adjust price so that it coincides with the total cost. For many people, that means fix it with taxes. In other words, impose a tax equal to the difference between the market price and the true cost, to force the buyer and the seller to bear the full cost of their transaction. This is what economists call internalizing the cost. We may not need to resort to government action, of course. One way we solve externality problems is called manners. If Carl tells Betty her crunching is bothering him, she'll probably apologize and stop. Then there's bargaining, a solution proposed by R.H. Coase. If Carl complains, Betty might make a side payment, sharing her chips with Carl. Once Carl's crunching too, there are no externalities, only chips. Even if these solutions don't work, it may not be easy to fix it with taxes through state action. Remember, the problem is information. Prices don't contain the full information about cost. But where can accurate information be obtained? How can the state be expected to acquire more accurate information and then act on it effectively? The most interesting answer to these questions came from the original scholar to propose fixing it with taxes, A.C. Pigu. Pigu was a really smart guy and understood that guessing at the correct tax would be very difficult. Back in 1920, Pigu said, "It is not sufficient to contrast the imperfect adjustments of unfettered enterprise with the best adjustment that economists in their studies can imagine. For we cannot expect that any state authority will attain, or even wholeheartedly seek, that ideal. Such authorities are liable alike to ignorance, to sectional pressure, and to personal corruption by private interest, a loud-voiced part of their constituents, if organized for votes, may easily outweigh the whole." The fix-it-with-taxes solution often has unintended bad consequences. The government has a knowledge problem, just like everybody else. Every economics student learns about externalities and Pigovian taxes, but professors rarely mention how hard Pigu himself thought it would be to get those taxes exactly right.
So, several things about that video. First, I weighed about 40 pounds more when I made that video, and one of the commenters compared me to the starfish Patrick on SpongeBob. You know, the big pink, which was infelicitous, but then I went and looked, and it's absolutely right. If you put glasses on Patrick, that's me. Pigu, I was astonished to find this, and in fact, if I asked most economists for the source of that quote from Pigu, they all say Hayek or Friedman. So Pigu is famous for being known as the person who suggested corrective taxes as a solution to externalities. But a fair reading of Pigu shows a much more nuanced understanding of the pretty pig problem. Because an externality means that prices don't reflect the full opportunity cost of resources. And it happens to us all the time. Markets are terrible at this. So we don't specify property rights, we don't control people's ability to use the atmosphere or the rivers or the ocean as a dumping ground for poisons and pollutants. Well, that's really bad for society when they do that. So we should stop that. Well, Pigu said that there are 3 problems with that. One is regulators don't know enough to do it accurately. They may not have the incentives to do it because it's easier just to let the status quo exist. And third, that they may be liable to sectional pressures. That is, the industry that is in their area may be more powerful, may be a more powerful voice than consumers. And so as a result, the state might make things worse rather than better. So as often happens, the sort of caricature that economists use to portray Pigu is inaccurate. What Pigu said was that this is actually an urtext of the public choice movement, I would say, which is the opposite of the way that it's usually thought of. So the question is how best to solve this problem. We have problems of information. What are the value of resources? Usually we use prices to value resources. But in the presence of externalities, or in the presence of common pool resources, things like the atmosphere, rivers, oceans, if I have two choices, I can pay what it costs to dispose of these poisons safely, or I can just dump them in the river and the river takes them downriver and that's free, but it really hurts the people downriver. Well, of course, I'm going to do the second, or many people are. You might be able, through moral suasion or a sense of social responsibility, to prevent some people, but some people are certainly going to act badly. We can't expect on the market to solve this problem. It won't. The question is, can we expect the state to solve this problem? Take out the word state and put in, can we expect Senator Robert Byrd from West Virginia to be in charge of regulating coal? No. No, we cannot. Unsurprisingly, Robert Byrd's coal regulations were pretty sympathetic to the coal industry, aiding and abetting their abuse of the atmosphere rather than preventing it. So the state, you can imagine, probably really is a pretty good alternative. The state that we actually have is much less so, and that's the one we're stuck with. So let me finish with a parable. People say, well, you're skeptical of the state doing things. What do you want the state to do? And what I want the state to do is not nothing, but the right kind of nothing. I lived in Germany in 2009. I lived in Erlangen, which is a little medieval town in Bavaria. It's in the Franconian section of Bavaria. And Franconia was settled by French Huguenots who had been kicked out of France and who had been oppressed. Southern Germany, generally, they seem to an American unfriendly, particularly to a Southerner, because I say hi to people. I see someone, I say hello. They don't do that. And in fact, if you try to talk to someone or smile at them, they'll say, we've not been introduced. And if you smile at them, they think you're trying to get something. There was a young lady who was fired at a local grocery store because she kept smiling at the customers, and they complained. There's something wrong with her. I often ran into trouble 3 or 4 times a day. I didn't speak any German. I don't speak any German. And I was told that that wouldn't be a problem, and it wasn't at the university, but it was a problem if I would go someplace like the grocery store. The nice thing about it was, once they realized I was American, they would all apologize for not speaking English, even though it was Germany. Because they all remembered not learning English in high school. They'd spent years not learning English in high school. So it's like Spanish for us. 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade, we all don't learn Spanish. So they really felt bad about having wasted all that time not learning English. They would apologize to me. It made me feel a little better sometimes. But there were some things that were cultural cognates that I thought I would recognize, which meant I thought I knew how to act. And one of those was the grocery store. So there was an enormous grocery store, the Kaufland. It's 3 stories tall and a big parking garage underneath. Now, I saw an elderly woman, about 5 foot nothing, in heels, but very nicely dressed, pushing her cart empty back towards the store. And I know what to do there. You know, I say, I'll take that for you. You don't have to take it all the way back. I'll take it for you. I couldn't say it, but I pantomimed. I thought in a way that was quite expressive. And her reaction surprised me. Her eyes widened and she dodged. But I had on more sensible shoes, and so I was able to intercept her, and she dodged the other way, but I was younger, and so I was able to grab her cart, and she started screaming amazingly loudly. And it's an underground parking garage, so it echoed. And then I saw a German policeman running. German policemen don't run. They're very sedate people. If they want to talk to you, they just do this. So if you saw even one move his face, it would be amazing. And this guy was running and looking right at me, and I thought, I've done something wrong. And he runs up to me. I'm not a small person, but he's a little taller than I am, and quite a well-built fellow, and I'm completely I'm going to die. I don't know what I've done, and I'm going to die without knowing what I have done. Runs up to me, starts yelling at me in German. I say, as I did 3 times a day, I'm sorry, I don't speak German. So he says, in excellent English, fortunately, what the hell are you doing? Where's your ID? So I don't have my passport, but I do have my North Carolina driver's license, and I start to show him, and he sees my Duke faculty ID. And he says, oh, my nephew was an MBA student in the executive program at Duke. I'm not going to die. So he realized I was American, didn't speak any English. He had been in the military and been stationed near an American military base, and so was pretty Americanized for a German and spoke terrific English, as I said. He asked me, and I said, I don't even know what I did wrong. I don't know what the problem was. And he explained to me, as you can see the euro there and the chain? I think it was a Ray Charles song, wasn't it? Unchain My Cart?
Yeah.
So in order to get your cart, you have to pay a fond, a deposit of €1. So what I should have done was give the old lady €1 and take her cart. I was trying to steal €1 from an old lady. And in her defense, that's exactly what I was trying to do. I didn't know it, but that's exactly what it looked like and what it was. Because I was trying to take her cart without giving her €1. And he explained this to me, and then the corners of his mouth started to turn up. He was trying not to laugh because his face would have broken and fallen off because he was a German policeman. But the corners of his mouth were trying to turn up. And he said, she's still watching, isn't she? And I looked, and this Uber Oma was peeking out from behind a post, her arms akimbo, wanting to see that justice was done, that this foreigner, this craven foreigner, was punished. So he says, all right, I'll tell you what, here's what we're going to do. And starts pounding me hard in the chest with his finger. I don't think she speaks any English, and so our business here is done today. He goes back, she goes back to her car. I go home and hide in my bathtub, like I usually do. That's the right kind of nothing. That's what you need the state to do. I don't want him sitting in his car saying, oh man, look, some old lady's getting beaten up. Where do you want to go for lunch? He needed to come over and find out what was going on. He could easily have arrested me, later let me go. I mean, it wouldn't have been much of a charge. I really was trying to steal €1 from an old lady. It's very difficult, though, to take that kind of minimalist approach. It's very difficult to define a set of behaviors and then make judgments that, you know, that wasn't so bad. Now, I don't know what the answer is for particular I don't know what the answer, this answer is for general policy problems, but I wanted to give you those two metaphors, the one at the beginning and the one at the end, as a way that I would hope that our discussions of policy could go. First, to recognize that both sides employ unicorns in their reasoning and criticize other people for having other than an ideal position, whereas in fact both of us have positions that there's real problems with. So acknowledging that and actually trying to look for solutions would be an improvement. But second, a lot of times we'd be better off if we would just try to do the right kind of nothing, rather than say, here's a problem, we need to do something, X is something, we should do that. So thanks for listening, and I'd be happy to have your questions.
When you say do the right type of nothing, you gave metaphors. How would it apply to, I know you said it's hard to say what the answer would be for general policy, but is there a specific example of it in policy that you could see where that would be a good solution? In American policy, an example where we could picture how it would be used correctly.
I would say that if you ask most legislators why it is we have such draconian laws that require the imprisonment of so many young men for use of drugs and the possession of drugs, they'll actually say it's because drugs hurt people. Well, no, jail hurts people. Mandatory prison sentences hurt people. Having 20% or more of the black men between the age of 20 and 35 in jail hurts people. So if we're actually concerned about people's welfare, we could stop hurting them. Nothing would be drug treatment, try to find alternative employment. I mean, we're always worried that we're going to give somebody something. It costs $60,000 or $70,000 a year to keep somebody in jail. Let's just call it good and give them half that. So there's a lot of situations where I think we use punishments in situations where we say we care about that person. So that would be an example of the right kind of nothing, yes.
Okay, so wouldn't that, I guess that would come to a judge's responsibility to decide when it was time to use the right kind of nothing?
It's a hard problem.
Prison?
It's a hard problem. We have mandatory sentencing laws and judges don't get to do that. So one of the reasons for the explosion in our prison population is the perfectly plausible claim that if someone's an habitual offender, we want to protect society from that. So you get arrested once, the second time you're in a car, somebody has a gun, it's not even you, the third time you steal a loaf of bread, and now you're in prison for 30 years. And people say, well, that's not what I meant. In fact, if you ask legislators, is that what you meant? Well, no, that's not what I meant. But they've taken the volition away from the judge. The problem is if you give people choices, some people are going to make bad ones.
So do you think that would be the better way to go, is to give the judges that type of, and
Even recognizing that means that some guilty people go free.
Okay.
So speaking of metaphors.
Loud.
I was wondering to what extent do you think Adam Smith's invisible hand metaphor is applicable to markets both realistically and morally? Because it's always seemed like a moral.
Repeat the question, if you would.
The question is about the invisible hand, and she said it seemed like a moral paradox. That how is it that people acting in their own self-interest could benefit others?
And is it even realistic that to require the markets?
My answer to that question is long. I'll give you the abbreviated version, knowing that it's unsatisfactory. The fundamental human social problem is the design or maintenance of institutions that make self-interested action not inconsistent with the welfare of the larger community. There's several ways that we can do that. One is to try to change people's perception of their self-interest, to get them to do an intersubjective reconceptualization of their interest. And that's the Rousseauian answer. We need to make people feel that they're embedded in a social context. And that means that, and we all do this is important. So I have two sons. I remember, because when you're 25 and you're about to have children, you think, oh, it's going to be so sweet. That's just a lie. You often have to break up fights. So I remember when my 3-year-old was just beating the bejesus out of my 5-year-old son with a big tree root. Whack, whack, whack. And I stop him and I say, that hurts. And he said, well, I know it hurts. He hurt me first. Well, don't do that. You have to put yourself in his place because it hurts. And he says, well, yeah, but he hurt me first and I wanted to hurt him. So what did I eventually do? I said, if you don't stop that, I'm going to hit you. And that's the second answer, is to put people in an institutional situation where they're going to act in their self-interest, but try to align that self-interest with the welfare of the larger community. So Adam Smith's example is the baker and the butcher. So the baker gets up at 4 o'clock in the morning, has a hot fire, he's doing this, he's thinking, I don't need this. That's a bread joke. I can wait. Puts it in, delivers the bread fresh and piping hot. Why does he do that? Because he loves you? No! It's because he loves profit. So it's in his self-interest to have the lowest price and the highest quality. But it also is in my self-interest to dump poisons in the river. So those two different contexts mean that the invisible hand doesn't always work, and that people that just say, let the market do it, are wrong. If property rights are correctly specified, there's no externalities, there's no public goods, we have an enforcement system where police prevent people from stealing euros from old ladies and that they don't commit those crimes, then it might work okay. It's not a paradox, but it's contingent. In a way, many people who are market advocates, I think, don't recognize. So I think you can construct situations where the invisible hand is perfectly plausible. And it's equally easy to construct situations where it's just not. But it's not a paradox. You had a question, sir.
One of the holes in fashionable economic discourse, including, I would say, libertarian discourse, concerns the omission of a very important component of every economic act. Every economic act has potentially 4 sub-acts. We produce things, we exchange things, we distribute them, and we consume them. Adam Smith did a great job of explaining production and exchange. The utilitarians did a great job of explaining consumption. To this day, no one that I know of has solved Philip Wicksteed's problem of how a mother distributes milk. And as social scientists, it's people who say we understand human behavior so well that we should be given the keys to the kingdom so that we can design an economy for you that's going to really do well. You can't explain how a mother distributes milk in the house, right? She has a limited, finite amount of milk. She wants to give some to the baby, she wants to give some to the children. She and dad would like some, if there's some left over, maybe the cat gets a dish. How does she decide? How does she place things in order? And obviously the answer is she does it based on her knowledge of the persons and of her love for them. So how does economics, as a social science, get away with designing the world without actually being able to understand the distribution problem, knowing that the vast majority of us, no matter how much money we have, if you ask a man how much of that money that you made last year did you spend on you and you alone exclusively, the answer is a very small fraction. The vast majority of it goes to our children. Some of it, a lot of it goes to our wife. Some of it gets spent on us, okay? A glass of whiskey here, a cigar there, right? But the vast majority of that money is given away as gifts. We literally give it away to the widow across the street, etc. But macroeconomic thinking doesn't purport to explain how we distribute. What can we do about that, or what solutions do libertarian or public choice economics have for that
Well, you know
problem?
you know the answer for libertarians, and that is that no one can answer that question, and therefore that mother and that father have to be allowed to make their own choices.
Okay.
Because they're the ones with the information to do it. Now, the problem with that, as many people on the nudge side would say, is that they don't actually know enough, and what we need is experts to tell them how to do it. So the contest is between autonomy, letting individuals do it because they have the most information, knowing that we don't know what they know.
Well, one of the challenges then is to get libertarians to at least become humble enough to acknowledge we don't know that, and so our theory has a big gaping hole in it. But you're not alone, because the Keynesians don't have these answers either. So,
Well, one difference, there are libertarians are much harder on heretics than they are on infidels. And so we end up fighting with each other over tiny points of doctrine that become the very fulcrum of the faith. So we mostly agree about this problem of autonomy, that people ought to be able to make their own choices. But then, like many people on the side we say we disagree with, we say, you should be able to make your own choices, and here's what they should be. Because we're short on humility. We don't have much of that. Many of my people really are authoritarians, dressed up as I'm concerned about people and I know how they should act. So I can tell how libertarian a libertarian gathering is by how many, if we're at a bar, we're at a table at a bar, how long is it before an argument breaks out about whether individuals should be able to own nuclear weapons? And it's usually not long. What the hell? This is not an actual issue, I think, that most people are very concerned about. But what they want to know is, are you a real one of us? So I think the problem of autonomy is exactly the right kind of nothing. So the problem is that means that we're requiring people to know how to make choices for themselves and their family. And some people just don't. So what do we do about that? The question is always, well, what about the children? What about the children of the mother or father who is a crack addict or doesn't come home and doesn't give any milk to the children, in fact sells the milk to get heroin? And I don't expect you to answer the question, but that's the counter
I
argument.
didn't have an answer for
Was there one in the back here? Yes.
Well, it almost seems like what you're saying is you're admitting the ability of fallibility in a way. I'm reading some planning theory right now, and one of the guys, LaFay, he talks about how any decent planner should shoot for utopianism, right? Or you might call that a unicorn. Utopia is unicorn.
Yeah, I don't think people know enough to do that.
Right. And so, I think,
And so the guy who I read, the quote from the one planner, we achieved our goals, but people didn't appreciate it.
Sure.
Because they wanted to get to work. You know how they are. So his utopia was achieved. Now, on the other hand, I did admit that we can't wait and see where buildings spring up at the university either. We also have to plan. So this would be much more satisfying if I was able to say, nope, planning's always bad, and it's not. And in fact, if I was trying to plan a university, I would envision a utopia. I would want to, how do the sight lines work? How does it create spaces where people want to work together and interact? You do need to have a utopia in mind. You do have to have some kind of ideal theory. So my answer is completely unsatisfactory. Yes. Well, you guys are double dipping. Anybody else hasn't gone yet?
I have a quick one. Well, you look at something like gun control, and I think that's kind of an interesting point because, and I agree with basically every premise you threw out there in your presentation, but you look at something like that, and it's, even if you tax, even if you regulate, I mean, I'm having a hard time finding an ideal situation in there. I mean, because
there's not going to be an ideal situation. The question is, can we do better than we're doing now?
Yeah.
Many people want destinations. I want a direction. If we stop going in the wrong direction, that would be a great improvement. So the question is, what would be a direction of improvement, do you think, for gun control regulation?
Well, theoretically, I'd lean more on more gun control.
But what?
Huh?
I use two hands now.
No, with the stock up against your shoulder
Yeah.
and everything, so you have, better.
So more gun control,
Yeah.
what specific dimensions of gun control would be an improvement?
And that's kind of where I'm concerned about, because I would lean more on government regulation, but like
Sure,
the
of
problem
course,
you
yes.
showed in your presentation, I look at that and say, well, you could put a bigger tax on it. You could say, we're going to lose so many lives a year. These lives are worth this much money going to the government. And if that's something society chooses, that's something society chooses, but...
Well, taxes are not likely to solve the gun problem, I think.
Yeah.
I think that's a complicated problem. The Second Amendment has two clauses, and it seems like almost everyone is concerned about one or the other. They emphasize it. So, I mean, it says well-regulated. It really does say well-regulated, which is different from the First Amendment, which says no law. So they could have said no law, but they said well-regulated.
Yeah.
And then they say the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. But it can obviously be regulated. So the difficulty that the left had, it seemed to me, was they openly were committed for a long time to confiscation. And the right was openly, let's all have nuclear weapons. So it's hard to reach a compromise there when both sides see a slippery slope.
What do you think the limits of markets should be when it comes to what we should and shouldn't commodify, and how do you think governments should regulate that?
It's a very difficult problem.
Repeat that question. We can't hear back here.
How should we decide what things should be a commodity? In a way, it's related to the mother's milk question. What things should be commodities, what things should be allocated via markets, and what things should be allocated in some other way. It's just wrong. So, in some ways, this is a moral question.
Yeah, because it seems like when you commodify something, you add not just monetary value to it, but social value. But then with some things, people think you actually devalue it, like organs or sex or whatever.
So I think that's a hard problem. That's something we could have a whole course about, and some people do. My own view of that is that I think voters are really bad at making that choice, because we tend to just to have knee-jerk reactions. If you ask most voters, abortion should be illegal. So if we're going to make those choices democratically, we have what I think are some problems with some infringements of basic rights. So the difficulty that we have is the one way we cannot make that decision is through democracy. So then what? Got really quiet all of a sudden. Yes.
Well, this even relates to that question. You said most voters, or earlier you said, I'll go back to what you said earlier, human beings are generally not knowledgeable about a lot of issues like the ones you mentioned here. And then you brought up, the milk situation. Some aren't aware of how much milk to give or if they should. And especially for the problems you presented here, do you consider education to be the solution to that problem? And if so, how would you educate people about these principles? Well,
Education's a help.
What I'm getting at is, and I realize things are leaning, as far as the presentation, almost, more towards libertarian, not so much government involvement. And if that's the case, then people should be allowed to make choices for themselves.
Even though sometimes they'll make bad ones.
And the flip side is, they do make bad ones. So do you consider education to be at least some sort of an option to help, counteract that? And if so, what would be the way of going about mass education?
Let's think about the consumers versus voters thing. The consumer is making a choice mostly for himself. If I choose a bad car, I have a bad car. Voters are choosing for everyone. So if I'm uninformed but I vote, I'm imposing a negative externality on everybody else, because I'm making a choice that we all have to suffer from, and my vote doesn't count for much. So knowing that, I can just vote for what I feel rather than what I think. I don't have to acquire much information. If I want to know about a car, I can actually get reviews about how a car works. Now, a lot of people don't, and that's a problem. But suppose I want to know what Donald Trump will do as president. Where would I go to look that up?
His previous, I guess, business
His
decisions.
previous work as president, or I could look at his speeches. They would be huge. So there's nothing I can just say, I like the way he's given it to the man. He's really going after the Republican establishment. And so let me say that Professor Stoner and I have an exchange on almost exactly this question at the Library of Liberty, if you're interested in looking at it more. It's not like we come up with any answers. I'd be interested to know if he had any response to this, also to that question. I've already said my piece. Do you have any?
Let me try a different tack, because I liked your analogy and I've been thinking about it, about the cards. So the right kind of nothing in the analogy was to translate and to reason, right? And that worked with you because there was also a judgment that the state made about your goodwill. And maybe
At least the absence of malice.
the absence of malice, right. But isn't a lot of what's involved when the law is involved, when government's involved, a question about judgments of malice or intent on the part of others? I mean, so political disputes get really sharp because of that, right? These terrorists wish to destroy our country, or these Americans wish to destroy our culture, as one or the other, right? Or these pro-choicers wish to destroy innocent babies.
It's a genocide.
Babies, right? And on the other hand, these pro-lifers wish to oppress women, right? And so it's that sense of right and wrong that stands behind, at some level, all of these political disputes that I don't think are able to be solved usually just by translation and reason.
Mm-hmm.
So there's something else, isn't there, that somebody has to deal with? And if it's not government, who, right? Or maybe it once was the church, which isn't part of the story of the pigs, the third pig, I guess. But something else that's forming these views, and in a pluralistic culture, of course, these are varied and differ, although maybe, that's sort of a question. How much do they differ? And how do we work out those differences?
Well, what tolerance are we obliged to have for what we see as error?
Yeah.
And the cultivation of tolerance for error, because I don't have to be tolerant of stuff I like. Tolerance requires that I hate it and yet still admit that, okay, a reasonable person might think that. So at Duke once we had George McGovern in to give a talk, and I got to go to the airport to pick him up, and I didn't agree with much that George McGovern had done politically. But after talking to him for 5 minutes, I would have voted for him or worked for him. He's one of the most charismatic people I've ever seen. He described his conversations with one of his best friends in the Senate named Barry Goldwater. It's hard to imagine a relationship like that now. And he said that the two of them agreed on almost nothing, but they disagreed over drinks, not over a battlefield that's scarred and pockmarked with shells. So yes, but they said they used reason to translate this into ideas rather than malice, rather than to attribute either stupidity or evil to someone who disagrees with you.
And so the question is, how do they come to that, right? And
how did we lose it?
Well, right, and I wonder if part of the answer is, this is my argument of the piece, right, is that this develops when people are actually in situations where they're making choices together about their futures. Now, obviously, we're not all going to be involved in that for the national government, but if we're involved in it in our own communities at some level, in some ways, where maybe just in the communities we've chosen, but at least there, that then we get that experience of understanding what you tolerate and when you have to draw a line, and you get the experience of losing when the line is drawn and you lose, and then
that seems like a
finding
good
another
point.
day and all of that.
That seems like a good point, but then it would be a result of the nationalization of politics, and this is the Tocqueville talk. So Tocqueville's point was that he was worried about national democracies enfeebling exactly that sort of vitality. Whereas participating in voluntary associations at the local level, and they could be political parties, but you and I are actually at a table, we're having a drink, we disagree, and we confront that in the sense that you're a human being, and I have to think, well, how could he think that? And you tell me. And oh, okay, I see, I don't agree, but I understand how you could believe that. Whereas I don't hear that if we just take turns shouting at each other in the Senate or using television. So the Tocqueville is a warning there, and I guess that warning seems prescient to me because it enfeebles our ability to have a vital political discussion where we're engaged rather than just engaging in trying to kill each other.
So like it sounds like the two sides are almost like polarities, but like what we've come to right now is sort of an insularization of the two poles, where they'll never come together for drinks, but they can exist separately.
Well, and if I see somebody on my team consorting with the other side, they're a traitor. It's not they're trying to build bridges, they're actually traitorous. And so there's internal mechanisms of in-group, out-group policing that are emotional. You had a question, sir?
Isn't the answer to this milk distribution, the mother distributing the milk, is just give everyone a little bit less than what they want, because everyone tends to overconsume. And they're usually happier with less than they thought they would.
What they want is a problem, yes. Everybody wants more. What we might try to do is give them what we need, but the judgments about what people need, if it's made by politics, might not be much better than by markets. But, well, perhaps you're right. Yes, sir.
Can you say a little bit more about this right kind of nothing? Because I could imagine, say, next week, instead of having you come back and talk, we have the old lady come back and talk, and she can tell a different story of how, she screamed, the police came in, and he told that American, he put him in his place. And so from her perspective, it wasn't that nothing was done, because the story could have gone a different way, where the officer and you could have sort of chuckled, the officer could have gone over, explained to her in German what happened, show the ID card, say, look, this is a good guy.
If she'd known I was American, it probably would have been okay, because we're so pathetic. So that might have worked.
But so what counts as, because you're using the story, I don't want to pick on the example, but you're using the story to illustrate what nothing looks like. But does it count as something if someone thinks that, something's going on, or what counts as,
Well,
it's
my
all
cons-
something, so what kind of counts as this right kind of nothing?
It is the job of prosecutors to represent justice. Except it's the job of prosecutors to get reelected. And the way to get reelected is to put people in jail. Their actual guilt or innocence isn't as important as the fact that you have a conviction. So we have a system that takes these words about justice and perverts it into something quite different. So the prosecutor who should say, I'm not going to bring charges, I don't have much evidence, is going to say, no, we actually have a person, he's not a very good witness, but there's a public defender. There's no way that the public defender has enough time to defend this case properly. I can get a conviction on a plea, and I'll get it so that my records are better.
I'm completely on board with the criminal justice side of this, but what does the right kind of nothing look like in something like poverty alleviation or welfare programs?
Well, as I have written, as you may know, if you take the total amount of spending that we have on poverty and divide it by the number of poor people, there are no poor people in the United States. Except that there are. How can this be? They're not getting it. Give it to them. Stop putting restrictions on them. Stop saying, we're going to make sure you're not married, there's no man in your house, that you don't have a job, that we're going to punish you for acting responsibly. Just give them the money. And then, when they get out of poverty, that's great. So I've argued for basic income. A much simpler system without all the bells and whistles where people have to go and interview, do you have a job? Well, if you do, you lose your benefits. Did you get married? Is there a man living in your house? Then go look under the bed. Oh, there's a man under there. You've lost your benefits. It's undignified. Let them have it. It's up to them. They're going to make bad choices. It's true. You have to accept the fact that if you give people choices, they're going to make bad ones. But some of them are going to make good ones. What I object to is the paternalism, the assumption that poor people are too stupid to make their own choices and we have to make the choices for them. The right kind of nothing is to say, let them make their own choices. Yes, sir.
This is just an observation to echo what you're saying, but in a conversation I had with Jim Capretta, who's former White House budget director, concerning the Affordable Care Act, I mentioned to him that I thought that we could solve the health care problem if we could get the American people to buy into two propositions, and we'll lick this health care problem. The first proposition, and it's not going to be easy to sell, but we've got to spend whatever it takes to convince them. Number one, you're going to die. The second proposition is that when it happens, you are not going to be healthy. And if we can get people to buy into these two propositions, we probably can save a lot of money on health care, much of which comes near the end of people's
Most of
lives. So to echo your point, there could be the right amount of nothing if we could accept certain realities.
It is awfully frustrating. My father, in the last 6 months of his life, he didn't spend it, it was from Medicare, $250,000. There is no way in the world he would have allowed anyone to spend that money if it was his, and he was almost dead. And he went from being almost dead and not very healthy to being dead, but it took $250,000 to get him there. I don't know that it made much of a difference.
Well, as Red Fox once said, all these health nuts are going to feel really stupid one day, lying in a hospital, dying of nothing.
On that note, thank you so much. If I could have your surveys back before you leave.
Awesome. You all marked awesome, I hope.
Yes.
It wasn't a choice.
Write it in. It's a write-in vote. Awesome for president.